Raw Toonage is a 1992 Disney animated series that is a series that hosted early shorts for what would eventually become actual animated shows from Disney, those shows being Bonkers, and a show that was based off of a comic of the same name, Marsupilami, which is definitely one of Disney's most obscure animated shows of all time, outside of maybe Nightmare Ned. In fact, I didn't even hear about this show in particular until I watched Toon Disney commercial breaks on YouTube, and the only thing that is really making me remember this show in particular is that back in 2018 through 2020, I basically made a list of every animated series produced by Disney in chronological order. Don't ask why. And going through every single show produced by them, 3 of these shows in a row were released right after another, and getting this review started right away, Raw Toonage is the centerpiece in what I like to consider the unholy trinity of Disney animated shows from the 1990s. Now, by all means necessary, these 3 shows, Bonkers, Marsupilami, and Shnookums Meat, are not the worst Disney animated shows of all time, not even by 90s standards. If Beauty and the Beast Belle's Magical World got to be a full show, like it was originally going to, that would be the worst one by a decent margin. But even some of their most infamous shows of all time were shows that stood on their own and were not connected in any sort of way. The unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows are connected in a lot of ways. Both Bonkers and Marsupilami were originally part of this show, and Shnookums Meat originated from Marsupilami. All 3 of these shows share pretty similar issues with each other as well, in that they either struggled to find their own identity, or it's obvious that they were trying to fit in with what other studios were doing at the time, Marsupilami and Shnookums Meat being the biggest examples of this, and even Bonkers, which originally wanted to be its own thing, absorbed a lot of these issues, as there was going to be a Who Framed Roger Rabbit series, and they apparently decided to use Bonkers as the main character instead, because there were issues regarding copyright with getting Roger Rabbit, but those are issues that will be discussed some other time, because today's subject is the show where both of these shows originated from, Raw Toonage. So, what is Raw Toonage about? Well, the best way to describe this show is that it does something similar to what Grim and Evil did, where that show basically had the earlier episodes of the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy and Evil Con Carne air simultaneously before they ended up splitting into their own shows later on. However, where with Grim and Evil, Billy and Mandy was the more successful of the 2 shows, while not too many people really remember Evil Con Carne. Raw Toonage just kind of throws something at the wall to see what sticks, as this show has a 3rd segment that you might not know about called Totally Tasteless Video, which basically tells a random story with a random character that we don't know anything about, with jokes that are also completely unfunny and confusing. I'm not joking when I say that these segments think that a channel where all shows revolve around characters being potatoes is inherently funny because potatoes. And there's also a similar problem in these segments as what I pointed out with Mad Jack the Pirate. The show inherently thinks that making pop culture references is inherently a joke, but they're not doing anything with it. It's just a reference and that's it. Also, with the Poultrygeist segment that they do in an episode, there's an episode of Chowder that basically does what this short tries to do, and they did it so much better. And another thing too, Billy and Mandy and Evil Con Carne started off as pilot shorts that were part of a poll, so people were already familiar with those 2 before they even premiered on Cartoon Network. I don't even think that people were familiar with Bonkers before this show came out, and Marsupilami being a part of this show was to its detriment, because from what I read online, most of the episodes of that show were recycled from the segments of this show, but then again, that show was aired on CBS instead of the Disney afternoon. And something else that absolutely floors me about this show is that every episode involves a random character from one of Disney's other animated shows hosting the series in between segments, either because Disney was desperate to have this show be noticed, or it's there to remind you that this is in fact supposed to be a Disney show, because if it wasn't for the fact that Disney characters appear, and if this show wasn't called Disney's Raw Toonage, you wouldn't expect this to be a Disney show at all. Instead, this show feels like it was made by another studio wanting so desperately hard to be like Warner Brothers that when Warner Brothers was trying to beat Disney in what they were trying to do, they ended up beating Disney at their own game. As this show is meant to be a variety show where it shows 2 or more segments with the wraparound segment in between, that seemed to be very unique in the case of this show, as not too many people did this beforehand, at least in animation, because I know that the Muppets did this, but that doesn't count. That's until a year after this show came out, when Animaniacs came out. That show basically did all of what this show tried to do, and they basically did this so much better. Just because of the quantity of different sets of characters who the short revolve around alone. Granted, I do believe that they were split in terms of quality. I like the shorts revolving around the Warner Brothers and sister, Pinky and the Brain, Slappy Squirrel, and Rita and Runt, but I don't like the ones revolved around Buttons and Mindy, Katie Kaboom, Chicken Boo, or the Good Feathers, while the Hip Hippos were in the middle. But those shorts had a specific flavor to them that made them stand out from the Warner Brothers and sister shorts. Meanwhile, both of the reoccurring shorts in this show have the same flavor to them. And well, it's really telling that Bonkers only started getting recognized more when it ended up morphing into a clone of Roger Rabbit, because without this aspect of the show, what else are you really left with? A show about an annoying bobcat that has an annoying voice by a talented actor that shows that he could do much better than that character, but how is that any different from Bubsy exactly? I mean, both voices are equally as annoying as the other, and are the worst roles played by their respective actors. I know that it's been kind of a running theme in some of my reviews, where I basically take a jab at Bonkers in some way, like in my review of The Wild, and coincidentally my review on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. To make this clear, from the episodes that I remember watching back in 2016, I'll be transparent right away, I really don't like Bonkers. And no, it's not because I got my opinions from the Nostalgia Critic. This show legitimately annoys me to the point where I'm looking forward to rewatching this series so I could give it its just dues, similar to what I did with The Wild, Ivan the Incredible, Monster Family, Lewis and the Aliens, Robot Boy, Thundercats Roar, and Family Dog. But one major talking point that I pointed out earlier that I want to expand on a little more is the aspect with Roger Rabbit. Bonkers was initially supposed to be its own thing, and when you watch the series and see the original vision for Bonkers, you can instantly tell, because these segments are drastically different from what Bonkers ended up transforming into. For one thing, Bonkers has a love interest in these shorts, and episodes just take place in anywhere it wants to. And second, Bonkers has an established partner in these shorts that entirely changed once the series came into existence. And as for Marsupilami, the other series that this show is trying to showcase that could make for a show, it's basically just a diet version of the Looney Tunes. You can't convince me otherwise. It basically tries to do exactly what Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck did in the Rabbit Season and Duck Season shorts, where Marsupilami and Maurice try to outsmart this poacher who tries to capture both of them, but there's literally no humor to it whatsoever. I mean, even disregarding the slapstick and visual jokes, which fall flat on their face because the jokes are way too predictable in these shorts. They don't have any sort of memorable or clever quips from the other characters to make the jokes land. And unlike Zig and Sharko, the characters barely offer anything to make their presence memorable or worth noting. Maurice is just there, while Marsupilami is the one who does the heavy lifting most of the time, but I think I should probably save the full discussion of both of these shows when I get to them at some point in time, especially because apparently most of the Marsupilami shorts in this show are recycled into the full show. As for Raw Toonage, I won't say that this is Disney's worst show, because it is meant to be a test to see how Bonkers and Marsupilami would work for an entire series, but all this show is in a nutshell is a rough draft for a series that not only did what this show did, but they also did exactly what this show did way better. So, a few episodes ago, both in episode and production order, I took a look at the centerpiece in what I believe is the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows, Raw Toonage. Today, we are taking a look at the actual first pillar, Bonkers. But in spite of the fact that this show is part of the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows, it's the only one of the three where it actually has divided reactions that come alongside it, believe it or not. Some people like the show, though I'm pretty sure that's mostly due to nostalgia, and others really don't like it, writing it off as nothing more than a clone of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And, I really hate to disappoint those who like this show and grew up with it, but I am in the latter camp in being someone who really doesn't didn't like this show. In fact, it's in the category of one of those types of shows or movies that I specifically have a bone to pick with, that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time now. Basically an Ivan the Incredible type of situation, to the point where I've often taken jabs at this show in some of my videos, my reviews of The Wild and Who Framed Roger Rabbit being good examples of this, because there's a bit of steam that I've wanted to get off my chest for a while about this show. Way back in 2016, before I was able to critique things the way that I'm able to do so now, I watched a few episodes of Bonkers, since I had nothing better to do at the time, and I really didn't like this show back then, to the point where when I started coming up with ideas for what I could do for my Sean's Network Reviews series, Bonkers was one of the first choices where I said that I should rewatch this show and give it the justice that it deserves. So, when I was able to find this show and rewatch it all from beginning to end, the show has only soured upon rewatch. So, what's the premise of this show? This show revolves around a bobcat named Bonkers. He got fired from his job of being a cartoon star due to the studio chasing after trends. But after he accidentally saves Donald Duck from being killed, he gets hired as a cop, and is basically partnered up with the stick in the mud named Lucky, or as the chief calls him, Pickle, when he's actually named Pickle, and then later on in the series, when Lucky leaves the show, he's then partnered up with the woman named Miranda. Now, I know what some of you in the audience are probably thinking. Ooh, this is nothing more than a Roger Rabbit knockoff. Well, if there is one thing that I will defend the show on, I'll say that no, this show is not a ripoff of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Because if you know about what happened with this show behind the scenes, this show was initially supposed to be a Roger Rabbit show, but presumably because of legal issues regarding Roger Rabbit's rights, given that Roger Rabbit is owned by Amblin, and Disney apparently didn't want to pay royalties in order to get as many of these cartoon characters from the movie into the show as possible, they had to settle with Bonkers being the main character in this show instead. That's why the final product comes across as being a Roger Rabbit clone, and it truly does show in the final product, because if you saw my review on Raw Toonage, Bonkers actually got his start on Raw Toonage in particular, and was actually planned to be something entirely different, basically being reminiscent to Looney Tunes or Mickey Mouse, with the characters being a lot more forgettable if I'm being blunt, and it didn't feel all that much different from the series that it initially shared the same show with, Marsupilami. Heck, some episodes of this show include shorts that are directly recycled from Raw Toonage. I'm guessing it was because they wanted to fill up that designated 65 episode quota that Disney did with all of its other shows at the time. But still though, the more you know about the behind the scenes stuff with this show, the more you could tell exactly what went wrong. Although, something to note about this show right off the bat is that this show was released in the 1990s, and on the Disney afternoon at that. At the time, they were extremely strict with what Disney characters they could show on screen, and for a show that began its production as a Roger Rabbit show, this resulted in the show becoming extremely neutered as a result. Basically being a Roger Rabbit show that could no longer actually be a Roger Rabbit show, and so because of this, we don't really see that many Disney characters in this show, and whenever we do, it would be extremely rare. No joke, there's an episode where Mickey Mouse appears, he's in a dog cage for most of the episode, and we never actually see him, and he's not even referred to as his proper name, he's just referred to as just the mouse. So when you basically strip all of this away from Bonkers, what you're left with is essentially just a generic cop show, with its only gimmick being that the cop in particular is a cartoon character. But if you went into the show without knowing this crucial piece of information, it makes the show come across as a pale imitation of Roger Rabbit, right down to the fact that a cartoon character is paired up with a cop in a world where cartoon characters and humans live together. But even beyond that, one thing to know about this show is that it went through a ton of production issues, and it truly shows. In other words, Bonkers is an absolute mess. Apparently behind the scenes, there were clashing ideas of what the showrunners wanted the series to be like. It initially started off with Bonkers and Miranda working together, but other crew members wanted Bonkers and Lucky to work together. So instead of just going with one idea, they decided to go with both ideas and tried to have a bridge between both eras, where Bonkers gets teamed up with Miranda after Lucky leaves the show, which didn't exactly work out since that episode was banned for years before eventually being put on Disney+, complete with both directions of the show having an entirely different style and feeling to it, as if they were two completely different shows. Heck, even the locations changed, and the Miranda episodes even introduced reoccurring antagonists that weren't a thing in the Lucky episodes. The Lucky episodes basically acted as a villain of the week show, and unlike with SpongeBob, Dexter's Laboratory, Family Guy, or the original Powerpuff Girls, where they changed drastically because of new writers and a new staff, the Miranda episodes and the Lucky episodes were always planned to be part of the same show, even having the intro be interspersed with clips from both eras of the show. Although, a problem that Bonkers has, regardless of which set of episodes that you go with, Bonkers is a very poorly planned out show because none of the two eras feel like they even exist in the same world, down to how the police building looks in both eras, and Bonkers looks extremely different going from one era to the next. Though, that's because the Miranda episodes were produced first, and were expected to air later on in the show's run. Too bad that Disney didn't get the memo, because 9 out of 20 of the Miranda episodes were previewed on Disney Channel months before the series premiere, and given that this was the 90s, before Nick, Cartoon Network, and Disney fully stepped their toes into doing continuity-based shows, Disney didn't really take this show's continuity into mind at all, so they decided to air the episodes in whatever order they wanted. So, they decided to air 20 of the Miranda episodes right in the middle of the 41 Lucky episodes, and so because of the fact that this show is directly split into two eras, I'll be judging both eras separately, as part of the same show of course, but they both have their own flavor of problems. The Lucky episodes of this show are awful. There is no other way around this. In fact, I'd even say that if the Miranda episodes of this show didn't exist, I would be able to confidently say that Bonkers would definitely be a candidate for the worst cartoons of the 1990s. Honestly, I'm baffled that they even wanted to go into this direction for the show in the first place, rather than sticking with having Bonkers working with Miranda. Granted, those episodes have their own problems that I'll get into later, but what sounds better to you guys? Bonkers being treated as an actual character that does do wrong with the characters actually calling him out on his actions, or Bonkers being treated as this gift from God who can't do wrong, while his partner gets the blame for everything? Personally, I'd go with the former option. So how can I describe the Lucky episodes the best way I could? So you know how around season 6 through 8 of SpongeBob, we started getting tons of episodes where Squidward starts being depicted as someone who got tormented for little to no reason? I'm talking about episodes like Boating Buddies, Wire Boys, That Sinking Feeling, Smooth Jazz at Bikini Bottom, Restraining SpongeBob, etc. Well, Bonkers is like if those episodes of SpongeBob forcibly fused themselves together with pizza delivery and was an entire show. Though this show came out 5 or 6 years before SpongeBob, but you get my point. In other words, a consistent issue that I have with this show is how horribly that this show treats Lucky / Pikel. And the reason as to why the show treats Pikel the way that it does is an answer that the world may never know. Is it because he's grumpy? Well, if so, that doesn't warrant him getting tortured constantly. You need way more attributes than just being in a bad mood. Take Squidward Tentacles in the good episodes of SpongeBob, for example. Him always being full of himself and narcissistic leads to karma being inflicted upon him. Him being put into that full body cast in jellyfishing didn't happen because he didn't want to go jellyfishing. It happened because he was gloating and acting smug about how he wasn't going jellyfishing with SpongeBob and Patrick. In a more modern example, life insurance. Him acting as smug as possible while being a jerk to other people led to the slapstick heavy ending. Lucky / Pikel is not a jerk at all, nor does he deserve any of the torment that he frequently gets throughout the show. Heck, I'd even say that he's more pleasant than Eddie Valiant from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He has a loving wife and daughter, which he does care for, he treats both of them well, and he has entirely valid reasons as to why he frequently gets upset with Bonkers, as opposed to Eddie, whom gets angry with Roger Rabbit over far less. Being a cop is serious business, and there's a lot of responsibility regarding the job, and Bonkers is frequently seen messing things up or directly disobeying orders from his superiors, even after Lucky left the show. While he does at least get called out in the Miranda episodes for what he'd do, even though it does come across as emotional manipulation, expecting us to feel sorry for him, especially in the episode where Bonkers and Miranda are tasked to get a supervillain named Z-Bot to the Japanese police, and Bonkers just gives him to a group of cat ninjas because he wanted to sign autographs, but not once during any of the Lucky episodes does Bonkers get called out by anyone other than Lucky. In fact, all of them are enablers towards Bonkers. In the first episode, when Bonkers says that he doesn't have any experiences with being a cop, Lucky gets rightfully upset and everyone actively tries to guilt trip him to let him be his partner, even though Lucky had this job for years, and so to find out that his partner is gifted when he never had any experiences with this job, he has every right to be upset. And the fact that Bonkers ends up messing up the case that they're trying to do in multiple episodes is an indicator of this. But Bonkers never has to worry about getting scolded, because the Lucky era of the show thinks that he's nothing but a saint who can do no wrong, even when he does do something wrong. And he's not even the one who gets the blame for everything. Lucky gets the blame for when things go wrong. On my rewatch of the show, I haven't forgotten about the fact that he basically grabs the chief's police car in an episode and gets no punishment for it. In fact, the chief literally congratulates him for doing this. And there are some episodes where it just spends most of its time tormenting Lucky for the crime of just wanting to relax or for absolutely no reason. The episode where Lucky is forced to look after this one toon that Bonkers is trying to hide is literally just a precursor to that one SpongeBob episode where the security system takes control of Squidward's house and begins attacking the city. But at least with Good Neighbors, you could make an argument that Squidward did something near the end where he got karma for getting a security system that took control of his house and started destroying the city, and that SpongeBob and Patrick were just ignorant. All Lucky wanted to do throughout this episode was have a relaxing weekend, but instead, he has to deal with this one clumsy toon who ends up destroying his entire home, which would have definitely gotten him into hot water with his wife. And Bonkers is entirely aware that Lucky wanted to relax, but sent the toon to his house anyway. And said toon was hiding from his old rival, making everything that Bonkers was trying to accomplish completely pointless. All being complete with an ending that just kicks Lucky while he's already down enough. There's also Once in a Blue Toon, where Bonkers directly lies to the chief about the process of how him and Lucky are doing with reforming this toon named Loose. Basically putting Lucky into this position where he would have gotten fired because of Bonkers. And when Lucky snaps near the end, because of how much of a loss caused that Loose is, the episode literally expects us to sympathize with Loose, despite the fact that him and Bonkers were more than patient with him, and he basically took advantage of that patience before proceeding to act good at the end, and then kicking Lucky while he was already down by introducing more bad toons that he's tasked to reform. But the episode Stress to Kill is an amalgamation of everything wrong with these episodes, wrapped up in one package, where Lucky is constantly stressed out for the entire episode because of the constant looming threat of the chief firing him because he and Bonkers are having a hard time capturing this mole art thief. But the worst part is, the chief threatens that he's only firing Lucky. Bonkers is entirely ignored, despite the fact that he's literally Lucky's partner. And a lot like Getting Over Davy from Weirdos, the episode offers all of the worst solutions to calming someone down from being stressed out or having some sort of mental problem, for a similar reason as to why the panic attack sequence in Velma is so hated. Calming someone down from being stressed out requires them being in a quiet environment, or even being at the spa where they're given a massage. Being wrapped up like a pretzel at a beach or painting something are just going to make someone more stressed out, especially those who are anxious about being messy. And they seriously thought that an isolation tank of all things was going to make Lucky calm down? No. The thing that would have gotten Lucky to calm down is giving him some personal space so that he would be able to relax on his own. And I'm just gonna come out and say it, I absolutely hate the chief in this show. I understand that the point of the series is that he's supposed to be a bumbling idiot. In fact, him being a bumbling idiot is the entire reason as to why Lucky didn't lose his job yet. But considering the climate that we're in right now, where the bumbling idiot in charge is causing things to go haywire IRL, that just made these jokes, and by extension this show, age very poorly. But his favoritism that he constantly gives to Bonkers is what drives me bonkers most of all. Even when it gets up to the point where Bonkers ends up being the one who directly caused him to get demoted to just being a regular police officer, but when Lucky ends up being forced to dress up as a clown and advertise another product, that is ultimately what deserves getting fired, according to the chief. And another problem that I constantly had with this show, regardless of whether it was with the Miranda or Lucky era of the show, is with Bonkers himself. Bonkers is Jim Cummings' worst role ever. character. Not only is Bonkers' voice absolutely grating in this show, but he comes across as horribly unlikable, despite the fact that the show wants us to see him as the optimistic and naive protagonist. You know, kind of like SpongeBob. But at least you could make the argument that with SpongeBob, even in his worst appearances, all of it could be chopped up to him being ignorant at most, with the exception of Choir Boys where he knew that Squidward was being stung by jellyfish. Bonkers is very much aware of what he's doing most of the time, and he just doesn't care. Like the episode where Lucky is forced to be on a diet, and throughout the entire episode, he just rubs it in Lucky's face that he can't eat the foods that he gets to eat for the entirety of the episode. Or the aforementioned episode where Lucky just wants to relax for the weekend, and Bonkers is aware that Lucky just wants to relax for the weekend, and still, he just doesn't care. And he doesn't get much better when Lucky ends up leaving the series. One episode has him going on and on and on and on and on about his poems to Sergeant Grading. He knows that he doesn't want to hear the poem that he made about him and doesn't care. And remember how in the Raw Toonage shorts, he had this partner of his named Jitters, whom he at least cared for? Well, in that exact same poem episode, he basically knows that Jitters has a headache and thinks that the best solution is to basically talk loudly to him. And it really says a lot about how annoying that Bonkers gets in this show when even Miranda, someone who is a lot more patient than Lucky, has moments where she just goes off on Bonkers, either because Bonkers is entirely ignorant towards her feelings, directly disobeys orders from her, or an important case is going on, pushing her to completely snap at him. And while we're on this subject, we might as well talk about the big elephant in the room regarding this series. Around the end of the show received a complete makeover, with a completely different art style and a complete change to the show's formula. It's no longer a villain of the week show. Bonkers and Miranda have a bit of a rogues gallery of their own, and in all fairness, these episodes are a little better than the Lucky episodes, though that's not saying much. That's like saying that being suspended is better than being expelled entirely, because at the very least, these episodes are less biased towards Bonkers than the Lucky episodes, because they actually have more than one of its characters calling him out on his mistakes. And also, since Lucky is gone from the show, the character that they chose as his replacement is Miranda's chief officer named Sergeant Grading, but at least they made the decision this time to have the pessimistic character be the chief instead of having him be Bonkers' partner, though these episodes do have their own problems. For one thing, Miranda is incredibly bland, and while I do prefer her and Bonkers' partnership over Bonkers and Lucky's, she's very forgettable, and because we don't know much about her, she comes across as, in the words of Nostalgia Critic, a character that has the personality of sandpaper. And even after watching every single episode of the show, I honestly have a hard time remembering anything about how her and Bonkers' dynamic worked. Like, true story, when I binge watched every episode of the show, I alternated between watching the Lucky and Miranda episodes and remembered more about how Bonkers and Lucky's dynamic worked than Bonkers and Miranda's dynamic. Though that's mainly because of how frustrating that the Lucky ones were. I mean, there are some episodes where Miranda does get impatient with Bonkers to the point of yelling at him, but other than that, she's just a generic blonde woman who is super serious a lot of the time, and not much else changed about the show all that much. Though, there are some animation mistakes that I noticed in some of these episodes that I'm surprised they were able to make it to air, specifically in the first episode where Bonkers and Miranda are paired together. There are some points where the colors are super saturated for whatever reason, and in the sequence where Miranda breaks down, it suddenly keeps on changing from night to day in multiple frames. And also, even after Lucky left the show, Bonkers' characterization hasn't changed a single bit. One episode has Miranda telling Bonkers to stay away from her sister because there was a chance that she could have reported about how her sister is working with a cartoon bobcat. Bonkers doesn't care about this and goes near her sister anyway. But like I stated before, these episodes were the earliest episodes produced in the show's run, while the Lucky episodes were produced last. So rather than the show evolving, the show actually devolved, primarily because of the fact that the Lucky episodes were produced after these episodes. So if I were to give out any sort of recommendations for this series, stay as far away from the Lucky/Mikkel episodes as humanly possible. If the Miranda episodes didn't exist at all, this show would have been an easy 2 out of 10, but because Miranda's episodes are here and were a bit of an improvement, it's a very light 3 out of 10. But the show does border on a 2 out of 10 because the Lucky episodes are most of the show, meaning that I don't recommend watching most of the show. And when it comes to the Miranda episodes, me recommending them is kinda debatable because of the fact that these episodes got rid of only a few of the issues that the Lucky episodes had. So instead, just watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit and 3 of the shorts that were produced after that movie. Or heck, watch House and Mouse, as because of the fact that it came out long after the restrictions on the use of Disney characters were lifted, it honestly feels more like a spiritual successor to Roger Rabbit than this show does, and offers more interactions between iconic Disney characters than this show could ever dream of having. So, now we reach the second pillar of the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows. And this is one that I don't have that much to talk about, Marsupilami, which is a 1993 Disney animated show based on a comic of the same name. So, back during my review of Raw Toonage, I briefly mentioned Marsupilami and what my thoughts were on it. I had no feelings towards this one in any way whatsoever, and watching the series proper and skipping the shorts that initially showed up in Raw Toonage, I consider myself stumped on what I could say about this one. I mean, I could reuse the exact same talking points that I talked about in regards to what I said towards Raw Toonage, but that would be incredibly lazy of me to do, just as lazy as what this show does in of itself, so I'll muster up the summarization that I could. The premise of this show is what you'd get if you basically made Looney Tunes and set it in the jungle. That is literally it. Kind of like how Shnookums Meat was basically trying to follow the crowd of what many other people were trying to do at the time with Ren and Stimpy, Marsupilami is basically doing this exact same thing, but with Looney Tunes. And this does make sense the more you think about it, because during the 90s, Looney Tunes was at the height of its popularity. You could literally go nowhere without seeing Looney Tunes in some form. One of the Looney Tunes spin-offs, in fact, Animaniacs, went on to become one of the most beloved cartoons of all time. So it was only a matter of time before Disney wanted a slice of that pie, and Marsupilami is definitely the result of that. And Marsupilami is what you get if you tried to take Looney Tunes and give it no flavor in any way whatsoever. There is one thing that does make this show stand out from Looney Tunes, I guess. That being that the titular character Marsupilami has this extremely long tail that he uses to spring himself into the air, which is what I'm guessing that Wow Wow Wubsy based its main character on. But otherwise, he just comes across as a more bland and one-note version of Bugs Bunny. And Maurice, Marsupilami's best friend, has the word nothing written all over him. You can't even say that he's the show's comic relief, though the show frequently has moments where he's dumb and gullible at the exact same time to either realize that he's working for the Jim Cummings poacher, or that he'd catch on to what he'd do, but get distracted by a banana. But the show doesn't really make any jokes about it. It's just kind of there. But other than that, I got nothing. To be honest, my comparison between Raw Toonage and Grim and Evil was right on point during my review on that show, because Marsupilami is to Bonkers like what Evil Con Carne was to The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, where one of the two shows went on to become a massive hit for the company, while the other fell into obscurity. But here, I use the word success very loosely, because the only reason as to why Bonkers ever got noticed at all is because the show was initially supposed to be its own thing before it got morphed into a clone of Who Framed Roger Rabbit that barely even wanted to be Roger Rabbit, but instead a generic cop show. In fact, if I'm being honest, Marsupilami very much comes across as if it was wanting to be the middle segment of a full Bonkers show, but was stuck as a show that was left to fend for itself instead, because when Bonkers did get a full show, the episodes were 22 minutes. But this show's early short shorts being on Raw Toonage was more detrimental rather than helpful, because I kid you not, there were only 13 new shorts that were produced for this show. The other 13 shorts that appear as the final segments of an episode of this show are all recycled from Raw Toonage, while the middle shorts are either a Shnookums Meat short, yes, Shnookums Meat initially premiered during Marsupilami, or a Sebastian the Crab spin-off series of shorts, presumably to get Marsupilami some attention, because I presume that even Disney knew that Marsupilami was not popular enough to have it stand on its own. But Marsupilami honestly shares the same purpose that US Acres did for Garfield and Friends, and I Am Weasel did for Cow and Chicken. It works more as a side dish to the main show rather than the main dish itself. I wish I had more to say about Marsupilami, but this show barely gives me all that much to talk about. I had more to say about Bonkers, as well as Totally Tasteless Video from Raw Toonage, rather than Marsupilami in of itself, because those two were interesting in terms of the issues that I had with them. Even the other two segments that appear in this show alone give me more to discuss than what is supposed to be the main course of the show. And while we're on the subject of that series real quick, I'm not going to discuss the Shnookums Meat shorts, because watching through all 5 of the ones that appear in this show, I can already tell that I'm gonna have a lot to say about it when I get to the Sean's Network Reviews episode on that show. So let's put our focus on Sebastian the Crab, not the character himself, but the shorts in this show. To be honest, these shorts honestly feel like they were originally going to be in Raw Toonage, but when that show was cancelled, it got switched to this show at the last second. Or they were trying to pitch a Sebastian spinoff to Disney and it got rejected, but decided to let those shorts be in this show in particular. And if the latter was the case, I'm gonna say that thank goodness for that, because these shorts are bad. So remember what I said about the Adventures of Bernie during my double review on Zig and Sharko and the Adventures of Bernie? Basically, copy and paste my exact same thoughts on the Adventures of Bernie onto my thoughts on these shorts. I am not kidding when I say that all of these shorts, with the exception of the Scout Troop camping short, are basically just nothing but watching Sebastian suffering for little to no reason, in ways that are not even funny at all, nor did he even do anything to really deserve his suffering. The worst one being the short where Sebastian basically deals with a female Pepe Le Pew, who basically violates his boundaries throughout the short. Also, as a spin-off to The Little Mermaid, there's not much that you could really do with Sebastian on his own. His purpose in The Little Mermaid was to make sure that Ariel was safe. That's pretty much it. Now, Timon and Pumbaa, which came out 2 years after this show, was able to work with this because Timon and Pumbaa had a dynamic that could work in a full show, same with the penguins of Madagascar. The only thing that they really do with Sebastian in these shorts is basically having his rivalry with Chef Louis return, but these shorts run this joke into the ground real fast. But other than that, despite the fact that Marsupilami is in the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows, this is definitely the best out of all of them, though that was a given because Bonkers had way more episodes, and it was worse than just being forgettable, and Shnookums Meat is one that I'll be discussing sometime soon. Marsupilami is just there. I wouldn't even say that this show is that bad in the grand scheme of things. I mean, with the Marsupilami shorts being here alone, this show would have gotten a 5 out of 10, but with Sebastian the Crab and Shnookums Meat being here, it dropped down slightly to a 4 out of 10. But don't think that it's over yet, because this is only the appetizer to what is the main course. And now, we are here at last. The final pillar of the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows, Shnookums Meat. So, during the previous review, you may have recalled that I mentioned that Shnookums Meat was not a show that started on its own, but rather, it began its time as a segment on Marsupilami, which, if you also recall, Marsupilami started off on Raw Toonage. So, we're talking about a spin-off of an animated variety show. And this subject that is being discussed right now is not only the most infamous of the 3 of these shows, but it's also what is considered one of the worst Disney animated shows of all time. The only ones that you could consider as being more hated than this show are Pickle and Peanut and Billy Dilly's Super Duper Subterranean Summer. And while I won't go that far, I mean, technically speaking, Beauty and the Beast Belle's Magical World was originally gonna be a show that ended up getting compiled into a movie, and if that show was able to be picked up, that one would be be crowned the worst one of the 1990s easily, but full stop, Shnookums Meat deserves at least the silver medal in this regard, because this one is bad. It's not the worst animated show that I reviewed, not even from the 90s, especially since I also took a look at Family Dog and Weirdos, and being honest, I would gladly watch this show over either one of those two any day, but still though, that doesn't mean that this show automatically gets a pass. So, what is the issue with this show? Well, it's plainly obvious what the issue with this show is. Right from the get-go, Shnookums Meat is a blatant ripoff of Ren and Stimpy. I know I've been comparing a lot of shows and movies to something else that had been done before, basically to say that I've seen this somewhere before, and usually, they don't take away from the experience of the show in particular. The problems that I have with Bonkers or Robot Boy, for example, have very little to do with the fact that they're similar to other products. But, that's all that Shnookums Meat is going to be known for. Every single element of this show either tries to be Ren and Stimpy, or some other cartoon that came out at the time of the show's release. Literally everyone was wanting a slice of that pie at the time, even Disney, as I've shown with Raw Toonage, Bonkers, Marsupilami, and now this. As the show revolves around a cat and a dog that don't exactly get along with each other, with a ton of slapstick, gross out, and overly detailed close-ups. But I'm basically just beating the bones of a dead horse at this point, because literally everyone has beaten this into the ground. Everyone is probably wondering while watching this review is, what else is there to talk about with Shnookums Meat? Well, actually, the question should be, what isn't there to talk about with this show? Giving this show every benefit of the doubt that I possibly can, there is nothing wrong with stepping out of your comfort zone. Disney have shown that you can step out of your comfort zone and succeed. In fact, that's actually what made the early shows that premiered during Disney's One Saturday Morning so successful. Their earlier shows did feel like early Nicktoons in a way, with Recess and Pepper Ann having a similar feeling as Rugrats and Doug, while still being their own show. Heck, Gargoyles, which came out a few months before this show, seem to have taken inspiration from Batman the Animated Series. But there's a difference between taking inspiration from something and straight up stealing from them. Giving Shnookums Meat some credit, they did make one change. In this show, instead of the cat being stupid, while the dog is the smart one, it's the other way around in this show. But that's the other problem with the show. Whenever it's not stealing directly from Ren and Stimpy, the show is extremely derivative of what other shows were doing at the time, whether if it's from either Nickelodeon or even from Warner Brothers. The dog being an idiot was being run into the ground even while this show was running. This show also has the human characters who don't show their faces in any scene they appear in, as well as having beautiful women that randomly make an appearance out of nowhere in certain episodes, and this extremely derivative feeling that the show has doesn't escape no matter which segment you choose. I'll be getting to these other two sets of shorts that Shnookums Meat is forced to share its time slot with in a bit, so to summarize, Pith Possum is a Batman spoof that I would have given the show credit for doing, as Ren and Stimpy didn't do a Batman spoof before, if a lot of what these shorts do weren't already done by Darkwing Duck, which came out 4 years before this show, and by the same company at that. Not helping in his favor is that these shorts were animated by Kennedy Cartoons, whom also did the animation in Darkwing Duck. And Tex Tinstar's constant use of narration and saying to tune in next week to find out what's next just screams Jay Ward, and I also got reminded of Dave the Barbarian all of a sudden, which mind you came out 9 years after this show, and I'd rather be watching that show right now than this. But okay, the show is derivative and is just Disney trying to directly copy off of Ren and Stimpy. Surely the rest of the series can't be that bad, right? Well, notice how when most people talk about this show, they only seem to focus on the Ren and Stimpy stuff. Honestly, even if this show were to be its own thing, it still wouldn't be good. So, you wanna know what would happen if you tried to make Ren and Stimpy while trying to play things as safe as possible? That's what you get with this show, where the show constantly feels the need to keep its characters on model, resulting in jokes not landing properly, and characters don't feel like they're exaggerated enough. Which is strange, because Pith Possum is able to do this well, where characters are able to be as stretchy and exaggerated as possible. Also, just like Family Dog, a consistent problem that Shnookums Meat has is that it often feels halfway stuck between being exaggerated and cartoony at the exact same time. In most cartoons, whenever something major ends up happening to a character, they end up being fine and back to normal in the very next scene. Or they basically have time pass in an unrealistic manner, most famously Ren and Stimpy, which casually mentions that 5 or 10 years go by at any chance it gets? Well, Shnookums Meat often has time pass in a realistic manner, leading to there being these extremely trucked up implications that'll make you look at the show sideways. The very first episode, for instance, where Shnookums and Meat are trapped in their home, leading to them having to eat expired cocktail weenies, the show implied that their owners were at the grocery store getting things, and I'm not joking. It's literally implied that it takes them 4 days in order to get something as simple as groceries, and 4 days pass since they've eaten something, to the point where they desperately want to eat. A pretty realistic depiction of a pet who is feeling very hungry, who have gone a long time without eating. And there's also an episode where this poodle constantly gets either dirty or put in pain, and you see the long-lasting damage of what happened to him throughout the entirety of the short. And the worst part is that he literally did nothing wrong. He's a bit whiny, yes, but that's not worth getting covered in sewage, having your fur falling off, being burnt by a grill, and directly getting covered in glue and cotton. But then there are episodes like Pain in the Brain, which have the exact opposite problem. Shnookums and Meat are able to come up with their usual ideas, and are also still able to function without having their brains be in their heads at all. I'm sorry, but if Fanboy and Chum Chum of all shows understood that when you don't have your brain in your head, you wouldn't be able to function more than you do, then you have a problem. But the biggest problem that I have with Shnookums and Meat is that just like Weirdos, I do not like a single character that is present in this show in any way whatsoever. As in, this is a show that gets very mean, while not having any sort of substance or things to support it to help out the meanness. And that's where the big elephant in the room shows up. This show was created by Bill Kopp, the same guy who also created Eek the Cat. So why is the meanness not as much of a problem in that show as much as it is in this show? Well, that's simple actually. That show has characters that we could sympathize with or like, such as Annabelle, Eek's family, and Eek himself. And while Eek was also a show that got very mean, especially in regards to what happened to the main character, they also showed that things could go right in the end when you bear through the unlucky tasks. By the way, if you're wondering, I don't blame Bill Kopp for this show being the way it is. If what ended up happening to Billy Dilly's Super Duper Subterranean Summer was an indicator of anything, Bill Kopp was probably obligated to make this show due to how desperate that Disney was to have a cartoony gross-out show of its own. Shnookums and Meat is just watching unlikable characters being awful to each other with no comedic payoff to it. Now, I get that this is the point of Shnookums. He's meant to be this show's Ren Hoek, highlighted by the fact that he does do selfish things, like leaving meat behind in the fish's mouth. However, in the execution of this show, Meat is not any better. In fact, he ends up being the one who instigates whatever happens between him and Shnookums a lot of the time. Night of the Living Shnookums being one of the biggest examples of this, where he basically makes Shnookums miss the ending of a horror movie he was watching, and then proceeds to chase Shnookums because he was saying that Meat was being a coward, getting up to the point where he literally runs him over with a toy train. Granted, it wasn't okay for Shnookums to fake the fact that he was dead, but it's not who ended it that is important, it's who started it. And his stupidity and misdeeds throughout the series often results in Shnookums getting in trouble right alongside him. The Christmas episode has Shnookums warning Meat that his socks smelled so bad that it would knock Santa out, and lo and behold, Shnookums was right. It ended up knocking Santa out. And now they are forced to deliver all the presents because of Meat, which honestly makes me speculate that Shnookums would be more of a good kitty if Meat wasn't introduced into his life, because he seemed to be happier and more calm without Meat being in his life. And whenever both of them aren't going at each other's throats a lot of the time, making me not want to root for either one of them, both of them are just awful in general. I brought up the Poodle episode a second ago, but I'll talk about it again because there's something else that I need to talk about. Shnookums was about to break a lamp over the Poodle's head before being stopped by Meat, because the Poodle wanted to watch his soap opera, and they just come across as being extremely rude and annoyed by the guests for little to no reason. I understand that he was a bit whiny in the episode, which could make him come across as annoying, but he does absolutely nothing in the episode to warrant this attitude and treatment from Shnookums and Meat. Whereas in other episodes of TV shows that you could categorize in the thing who wouldn't leave trope, the character at least does something to the main character that makes it justifiable to why they want them out of their house. Most notably the Rocko's Modern Life episode Bedfellows, and I didn't even like that episode in spite of the fact that I do like that show. In fact, I feel more sorry for the Poodle in particular because Shnookums and Meat end up being the entire reason as to why he gets brutally injured by the end of the episode. And being someone who is on the spectrum, who has a lot of the same same kinds of traits that the poodle has in this episode, the ways that this episode treats him for being like this utterly disgusts me. Even the show itself seems to acknowledge that these two are an absolute problem. The episode Step Ladder to Heaven is an entire episode that drills it into our heads that these two are nothing but a menace to society, but they literally do nothing about it. And they aren't really able to do anything about it because this was one of the last episodes produced specifically for the show, as most of the episodes in this show were recycled directly from Marsupilami. This even extends to the owners, and it's not Ren and Stimpy that they took from this time around. The owners seem to be taking a lot from Tom and Jerry, but what worked in Tom and Jerry is that the show actually gave us a valid reason as to why Tom got threatened by his owners that something bad would happen to him if he didn't do something, like not catching Jerry for instance, or that something bad would happen if the house was a mess. Heck, even in the Tom and Jerry comedy show, while the owners were worse in that show, they understood why the owners were that harsh to Tom on some level. In this show, the owners scold Shnookums and Meat for some of the dumbest reasons ever, such as their pets being fat and lazy, despite the fact that they complain just as much as they do when Shnookums and Meat chase each other, and also threatening that if Shnookums and Meat bring fleas into their house, that they would make them live outside. Basically blaming Shnookums and Meat for having fleas instead of giving them some anti-flea medicine or ointment. Also, these people totally earned the reward for Pet Owners of the Year for basically leaving their pets at home with no food for 4 days while you were at the grocery store. By the way, I was being sarcastic. Honestly, do you see why I decided to choose not to talk about the Shnookums and Meat segments during this Marsupilami review? Because that would have been a waste of time anyway, especially when out of all 13 episodes of this show, 5 of them were recycled from Marsupilami, meaning that only 8 new shorts were produced for this show. That's even less than the new shorts made for Marsupilami, which at least had 13. Which were the other segments that were in this show? Well, a lot like Eek the Cat, this show shared 2 other sets of shorts for its entire run of episodes, and both of them got to be in the full 22 minutes of each episode, meaning that you only got 1 episode per week. And once again, this was to Shnookums and Meat's detriment, because 5 out of 13 are basically relying on early material, making you question why these segments were originally on Marsupilami in the first place. Anyways, the segments included in this show are Pith Possum, an obvious spoof of Batman, though they're presumably spoofing the Adam West Batman, since Batman took itself a lot more seriously around the time of this show's release. These segments are eh. I could get onto these shorts for how mean-spirited that they often get towards Pith Possum himself, especially in the Superhero Con episode, where they constantly call him a rat and none of them take him seriously at all, or how sorry I feel for Pith Possum, who got distracted from his date with Doris so much that she got up and went home. But given that these segments are trying to be a parody of superheroes, I can't get too mad at it. And Tex Tinstar being in Shnookums and Meat was kind of to its detriment, given that these segments were trying to be more continuity driven than the others. And like I said during my review of Bonkers, this was in the 90s, before being more continuity driven became more common in animated shows. Also, Jeff Bennett in this show uses the exact same voice that he used for Johnny Bravo, so all I could hear while watching this show is Johnny Bravo, though at the time it would be 2 years before that show were to come out. But to close out the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows, I'll say that while these 4 shows were not very good, the only ones that I found to be really bad were this show and Bonkers. The others were either on the lower end of bad or just plain bad. They were made in a different time, where Disney was trying to step its toes into being more cartoony, which resulted in these 4 shows in particular, though that philosophy ended up working much better later on with shows like Timon and Pumbaa, Dave the Barbarian, Wander Over Yonder, The Ghost and Molly McGee, etc. But bear in mind, just because these were the unholy trinity of 90s Disney animated shows, that doesn't mean that they are the absolute worst Disney animated shows of all time, especially since I've yet to have rewatched some of the more infamous ones. They share something in common in being a showcase of Disney television animation's awkward beginnings and trying to be cartoony.